suddenly, it's all so clear. Looking back, I can see the little warning signs we ignored. But in the moment, we were just a group of friends out for a good time. I guess we were asking for it. Last summer, my friends and I decided to get away from it all. There were five of us: me, Eric, Ryan, Mia, and Jess. We crammed into Eric's rusty old SUV, which groaned under the weight of our camping gear, snacks, and an ambitious supply of cheap beer. The plan was simple: find a remote cabin, disconnect from the world, and have the kind of carefree weekend we'd all been craving. The drive out was half the fun. Ryan, the self appointed class clown, kept us entertained with terrible jokes and exaggerated impressions of every bad horror movie villain you could think of. Eric, ever the responsible one, rolled his eyes but couldn't hide his grin. Mia and Jess sat in the back seat, alternating between singing along to the radio and teasing Ryan for his antics. As for me, I was just happy to be there, soaking in the easy camaraderie that made everything feel lighter, even under the blistering summer sun. The cabin we rented was as remote as they come: no Wi-Fi, no cell service, and the nearest neighbor a good mile down the road. It was perfect, a small wooden structure nestled in the middle of a dense forest, surrounded by towering trees that seemed to whisper secrets to one another in the wind. At night, the stars were so bright and close that it felt like you could reach out and touch them. We spent the first evening laughing around a campfire, roasting marshmallows, and telling ghost stories we all pretended weren't creepy. The trouble started on our second day. We decided to go for a hike, aiming to explore the woods and maybe find the lake we'd heard about from the cabin's owner. The trail was overgrown, but easy enough to follow, winding through groves of ancient trees and patches of wildflowers that seemed almost too perfect, like something out of a painting. Ryan, of course, couldn't resist straying off the path whenever he thought he'd found something interesting. It was one of those detours that led us to the graveyard. The place appeared out of nowhere, like it had been waiting for us. One moment, we were surrounded by the endless green of the forest, and the next, we were standing in a clearing filled with crumbling tombstones. The air felt different there, heavier, colder, and eerily silent. Even the birds, which had been chirping nonstop, seemed to have vanished. "Whoa," Mia said, breaking the silence. "This is creepy." "Nah, it's awesome," Ryan said, grinning. "We've officially found the set of every horror movie ever made." The tombstones were old, some so weathered that the names and dates were barely legible. A few were tilted at odd angles, as though the earth beneath them was trying to reclaim them. But one grave stood out. The stone was clean, its lettering sharp and clear, as if it had been carved yesterday. It read, "Here lies Thomas Whitaker, who laughed himself to death." Ryan burst out laughing. "Are you kidding me? That's real? Someone actually wrote that?" He bent over, clutching his sides as he exaggerated his laughter. What was he laughing at? The bill for this gravestone? I couldn't help it. I laughed too. We all did. It was absurd, and in the middle of that eerie graveyard, absurdity felt like a welcome relief. Mia pulled out her phone to snap a picture of the stone, while Eric and Jess joined in, posing dramatically next to it as if they were reenacting poor Thomas Whitaker's final moments. But Ryan, of course, had to take it further. He threw himself onto the ground, clutching his sides and gasping for breath like he was in the throes of some comedic fit. "Oh no," he cried. "It's happening. Someone save me. I'm laughing myself to death." That's when we noticed the old man. He appeared at the edge of the clearing, so silently that none of us saw him approach. He was tall and wiry, with skin like aged leather and eyes that seemed to pierce right through you. His clothes were plain, a worn flannel shirt and dusty jeans, but there was something about him that made my skin crawl. "Show respect for the dead," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Do not laugh at their fate." We froze. His words hung in the air like a physical weight, and for a moment, no one moved. Then Ryan, ever the fearless idiot, broke the tension. "Come on, man," he said, still grinning. "It's just a joke." The old man didn't respond. He just stared at us, his expression unreadable. Slowly, he shook his head, then turned and disappeared back into the trees as silently as he'd come. We stood there for a moment, the laughter gone, replaced by a heavy, uneasy silence. I glanced at Ryan, expecting him to crack another joke, but even he looked a little shaken. Still, as we left the graveyard and made our way back to the cabin, we brushed it off. It was just a weird encounter, we told ourselves. Nothing to worry about. The porch creaked as we hurried inside, filing into the cabin without a word. It wasn't until we were sitting around the fire pit later that night, beers in hand, that the tension began to ease. Eric tossed another log onto the fire, sparks spiraling into the star-filled sky. "All right," he said, breaking the silence. "We need to forget about that creepy guy. Let's make this trip fun again. Who's got a good ghost story?" Mia groaned. "Seriously, after what happened today, you want to tell ghost stories?" "Come on, Mia," Ryan said, his grin making a comeback. "Don't tell me the old man spooked you. He was just some cranky local, trying to scare us off. Probably gets his kicks freaking out tourists." Jess nodded, though she didn't look entirely convinced. "Yeah, he was creepy, but it's not like he's following us or anything." That was enough to get everyone talking again. One by one, we shared the worst, cheesiest ghost stories we could think of, each trying to outdo the other with exaggerated scares and bad impressions of creepy voices. Ryan leaned into the role of showman, adding theatrical flair to every story. By the time it was his turn, we were all laughing, the tension from the graveyard slowly melting away. All right," Ryan said, raising his hands as if to quiet an imaginary crowd. "I've got a good one. It's about this guy, Thomas Whitaker. Heard of him?" Mia groaned again, but the rest of us laughed. Ryan stood up, adopting a dramatic tone as he gestured at the firelight. "Thomas Whitaker, who laughed himself to death. Legend says he's still out there, wandering the woods, looking for people to share the joke with. But if you hear his laugh," before he could finish, we heard it. A faint laugh, so quiet, we almost missed it. It came from somewhere deep in the woods, just beyond the edge of the firelight. It was so sudden, so unexpected, that we all froze. "Very funny, Ryan," Jess said, rolling her eyes, though her voice was unsteady. "You can stop now." "It's not me," Ryan said, holding up his hands, his grin faltering. The laugh came again, louder this time. It was slow and wheezy, like someone struggling to breathe between chuckles. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, sending a chill down my spine. I glanced at Eric, who was staring into the darkness, his jaw tight. Maybe it's a coyote, Eric said, though he didn't sound convinced. They make weird noises sometimes. Coyotes don't laugh, Mia whispered, her voice barely audible, but carrying an edge of fear that made my stomach tighten. For a few minutes, we just sat there, listening. The laughter circled us, moving through the trees. It wasn't constant. It would start and stop, as if whoever, or whatever, was laughing wanted to keep us guessing. At one point, it sounded like it was right behind me. My heart slammed against my ribs as I whipped around, my eyes searching the shadows. There was nothing there, just darkness. Okay, this isn't funny anymore, Jess said, her voice shaking. Let's go inside. We didn't argue. Eric stomped out the fire, his movements quick and tense, and we hurried back to the cabin, locking the doors behind us. Once inside, we tried to laugh it off. It's just some animal, Eric said, forcing a smile. Or maybe there's a campground nearby. Could have been other hikers messing with us. But we all knew it wasn't true. The sound wasn't natural. It wasn't human either. Not exactly. And it definitely wasn't over. That night, as we tried to sleep, the laughter came back. I had just started to drift off when I heard it again. Louder now and more distorted. It didn't sound like it was outside anymore. It seemed to echo off the walls of the cabin, coming from every direction at once. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding as the sound grew closer and closer. I could hear Ryan shifting in the bed across the room, muttering something under his breath. Jess let out a nervous laugh from her room, but it sounded forced. None of us wanted to admit we were scared. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the laughter stopped. The silence was worse. It was heavy, oppressive, like the cabin itself was holding its breath. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare breathe. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew this wasn't just a prank or a coincidence. Something was out there. Something was watching. I didn't sleep at all that night. A voice, unmistakably Ryan's, called out, "Hey guys, open the door," sounding as casual as if he were asking for a drink of water. "Come on, it's freezing out here." Jess shook her head, whispering, "Oh no." Mia's grip tightened on my arm. "That's not him," she hissed. "It can't be." "Let me in," the voice repeated, and though it sounded exactly like Ryan's, there was something strange about it. Too smooth, too perfect, like a recording on a loop. The footsteps stopped near the window closest to Jess. She shrieked and scrambled away as a shadow passed over the curtain, tall, thin, almost impossibly so. "Guys, what's wrong? Don't you recognize me?" The voice came again, closer this time. The shadow lingered, unmoving by the window. It stretched upward, its form grotesque, the head too narrow, the arms too long. It bent slightly, as if peering inside. For a horrifying moment, I thought it might press its face against the glass. Then the laughter began, a low, wheezing sound, like whoever or whatever was outside found the whole situation amusing. The footsteps shuffled away, moving from the window. Instinctively, I pulled Jess further into the corner, just as the shadow faded into the darkness. The laughter continued to fade, replaced by an oppressive silence. We stayed quiet for a long time, none of us knowing what to say. Eric eventually lowered the fire poker, his knuckles white from gripping it so tightly. Mia sat on the floor, knees pulled to her chest, while Jess rocked back and forth, eyes wide and unblinking. I glanced at the clock. Only 2 a.m. It felt like morning was a lifetime away, and the thought of enduring hours like this was unbearable. I paced the room, desperate for any solution. We need to get out of here, I finally said, breaking the silence. First light, we head to the car and don't look back. No one argued, but the doubt in their eyes was clear. The cabin felt like a cage now, the walls too close, the shadows too dark. Even with the fire poker in hand, we knew deep down that whatever was out there, we couldn't fight it. Morning was our only hope. What if it doesn't wait until morning? Mia whispered, barely audible. What if it comes back? Eric sighed, his shoulders slumping. Then we stick together. No one goes anywhere alone. We keep the lights on, and we wait. Jess finally looked up, her face pale and streaked with tears. And if it gets in? None of us had an answer. The unspoken truth settled over us like a heavy blanket. If it got in, there was nothing we could do. We spent the rest of the night in silence, the weight of fear pressing down on us. The fire in the hearth burned low, casting long, flickering shadows. Every creak of the cabin and gust of wind outside made us jump, and all the while, the question lingered in my mind. What if it was already inside? The minutes crawled by, each tick of the clock a cruel reminder of how far we were from dawn. The cabin had grown unbearably quiet, save for the faint crackling of the dying fire. None of us dared move too far from each other. Eric kept his grip on the fire poker, knuckles stark white against the dim light. Mia rocked slightly on the couch, trying to soothe herself, while Jess huddled in the corner, her wide eyes darting to every shadow. I couldn't stop pacing, the anxiety in my stomach growing with every creak of the floorboards. My mind spun in circles, trying to make sense of what we had seen, heard, the photo of Ryan, the voice at the door, the shadow by the window. None of it made sense. It's testing us, Mia said suddenly, breaking the silence. We all turned to look at her. She was staring at the floor, arms wrapped tightly around herself. It's trying to see what we'll do, how far we'll go. What are you talking about? Eric asked, his voice sharp. Think about it, Mia said, her voice trembling. It's not just scaring us, it's playing with us. The photo, the laughter, the voice. It could have come inside already if it wanted to, but it's waiting, watching. That's insane, Eric said, though his fear was evident in his eyes. Is it? Mia shot back, her tone biting. Tell me one thing about this that's normal. Just one. Eric didn't respond. None of us did. The silence stretched out again, heavy and oppressive. The fire was almost out, casting longer and darker shadows. The tension in the air was palpable, pressing down, making it hard to breathe. Without warning, the front door slammed open. The sound was deafening in the silence. a gust of cold air rushing through the room. We all screamed and jumped to our feet as the door banged against the wall, the hinges groaning under the strain. Eric raised the fire poker, hands shaking, but there was nothing there. The doorway was empty, the forest beyond shrouded in darkness. Close it, Jess screamed, her voice high-pitched with panic. Eric rushed to the door, slamming it shut and locking it, his movements frantic. What the hell was that? He yelled. As dusk fell, the forest seemed to transform with the fading light. Shadows stretched longer, darker, more suffocating. The road narrowed, and the trees grew closer, their branches forming a canopy that blocked the last rays of daylight. Eric slowed the car as the GPS instructed us to take another turn. This new road was even narrower, the pavement cracked and uneven. The air inside the car grew thick, the silence broken only by the soft hum of the engine. It was when night fully enveloped us that the first unsettling event occurred. Without warning, something slammed against the windshield with a deafening thud. We all screamed in unison, the sound tearing from our throats. The figure appeared suddenly, its face pressed against the glass, a grotesque grin stretching impossibly wide. Its hollow dark eyes stared directly at us, unblinking, as though it could see into the very heart of our terror. The pale, almost translucent flesh of its face flattened against the windshield, barely visible in the dim glow of the dashboard lights. What the hell is that? Jess shrieked, clutching the sides of her seat. Eric's voice cracked as he shouted, "Hold on." He floored the gas pedal, and the car lurched forward. The figure clung to the windshield for a moment, its grin never fading, before it scraped off with a sickening sound. Its body crumpled unnaturally as it hit the ground. But when I glanced back, it was already standing, head slightly tilted, that terrible grin still etched across its face as it watched us speed away into the darkness. The car continued down the winding road, the oppressive silence only broken by the occasional GPS directions. Eric's hands gripped the wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. I could see his jaw clenched, eyes darting to the rearview mirror, as if expecting the smiling figure to reappear. Jess sat in the back seat, arms crossed tightly, her gaze fixed on the window. Mia sat beside her, gripping the edge of her seat, wide-eyed, scanning the passing trees and the GPS screen. No one had spoken since the figure slid off the windshield, and I couldn't blame them. My thoughts were a chaotic mess, and every shadow outside seemed like it could leap out at us. Finally, Mia broke the silence, her voice trembling. What, what the hell was that thing? No one answered. Jess shifted uncomfortably, pulling her jacket tighter, but remained silent. Eric kept his eyes on the road, his jaw tight as he processed everything in his mind. I wasn't sure if I should comfort Mia or stay quiet, but the words escaped before I could stop them. It wasn't human, I said, my voice hollow. Nothing human moves like that. Eric exhaled sharply, his version of a bitter laugh. No kidding. Do you think it's following us? Jess finally asked, her voice low and laced with fear. I don't know, Eric admitted, but I'm not stopping to find out. The GPS chimed. Again, its mechanical voice cutting through the quiet. In 3 miles, turn left. We're not far from the highway, Eric said, voice strained but steady. Once we're out of the woods, we'll head straight to the police. They'll They'll know what to do. He paused, glancing in the rearview mirror again. They'll know. Mia scoffed softly. You think the cops are going to believe us? That something's out here chasing us. What are we even going to tell them? We tell them the truth, I said, though as I spoke the words, I wasn't sure I believed them. We tell them about Ryan, about what happened at the cabin, about that thing. Jess shook her head, letting out a humorless laugh. Yeah, great. Hey, officer, there's a smiling monster in the woods. That'll go over well. We don't have another option, Eric said firmly, unless you want to go back and deal with it yourself. That shut Jess up, and the car fell silent again. Outside, the trees pressed closer, their skeletal branches forming a canopy overhead that blocked out the moonlight. The road had grown even narrower, the cracked pavement littered with fallen leaves and debris. I glanced at the GPS screen. We were still 2 miles from the turn. The tension in the car was suffocating. Every bump, every rustle outside made my heart race. Then the laughter started. It was faint at first, a low, guttural sound echoing from somewhere in the forest. It began as one voice, but quickly multiplied into a cacophony of mocking laughter coming from all directions at once. Do you hear that? Mia whispered, her voice trembling. How could we not? Jess snapped, her face pale. The laughter grew, louder, closer, until it felt as if it was coming from inside the car. Eric's grip on the wheel tightened, his knuckles turning even whiter. Just ignore it. Keep calm, he muttered, more to himself than to us. Then something dark and fast blazed past the car. It was just a blur at first, but it circled back, darting so close to the windows that we all flinched. It moved too quickly to make out, as best as he could. Eric's gaze flickered nervously between the dead engine and the darkness outside. When he hung up, he exhaled a shaky breath. They're sending someone. We just have to wait. Jess let out a bitter laugh, though it lacked any humor. Wait for what? For that thing to come back for help? I spoke, the words feeling hollow. I said we wait. We're getting help. Eric turned back to us, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. We stay in the car. Keep the doors locked. Whatever this is, it's safer in here than out there. And what do we tell them when they get here? Jess's voice rose slightly. Do we tell them about Ryan? About that thing? They're going to think we're crazy. Mia spoke, firmly, though her words sounded final. We tell them the truth. All of it. Let them think we're crazy. At least we'll be out of here. Jess shook her head, but didn't argue. The tension in the car was suffocating, the silence too thick to break. None of us wanted to admit it, but the thought of seeing Ryan's body again, or worse, not seeing it at all, was gnawing at us. What do you think happened to him? I asked softly, my voice barely cutting through the tension. There was no immediate answer. Then Eric spoke. I don't know. Maybe he got up and walked away. Walked away? Jess's voice cracked, sharp and bitter. After lying there like that, with that grin on his face? Are you hearing yourself? Eric snapped back, frustration bubbling over. Do you have a better explanation? I'm all ears. Mia's gaze was distant, her voice barely a whisper. Maybe it wasn't him. Maybe it's like a trick. Like that thing is trying to mess with us. Her words sent a chill down my spine. It was a thought that had crossed my mind, but hearing it aloud made it feel real, too real. Time dragged on, each second stretching into eternity. Every creak of the trees, every rustle of leaves outside felt like it could be the start of something terrible. The laughter had faded, but the oppressive weight of the night pressed down on us, suffocating, inescapable. Finally, after what felt like hours, faint headlights appeared in the distance. Relief washed over me so suddenly that tears pricked at my eyes. They're here, I whispered. The police car pulled up slowly, its lights cutting through the darkness. Two officers stepped out, their flashlights sweeping the area as they approached. One of them tapped on the driver's side window, and Eric rolled it down just enough to speak. "We got your call," the officer said, his tone professional but wary. "Are you all right?" "We're alive," Eric replied, his voice strained. "But something's out here. Our friend was lying right there." He pointed toward the tree, "but now he's gone." The officers exchanged a glance, their expressions unreadable in the dim light. "Stay in the car," one said. "We'll check it out." We watched as they moved toward the tree, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The night had grown eerily quiet, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. My stomach churned with dread. We were no closer to understanding what was happening. It was almost dawn when the police finally led us away from the scene. None of us had slept. We were all bundled into separate squad cars, the officers exchanging clipped conversations on their radios. I could hear Jess's soft crying from the car ahead of me. Eric sat beside the officer driving, his face pale and unreadable. Mia was in the car behind, her hands visible through the rear windshield, clutching her knees to her chest. At the station, we were separated into different rooms. Each of us questioned individually. The officer sitting across from me seemed calm, his voice low as he began. "So, can you walk me through what happened?" he asked, clicking his pen. I tried to explain about Ryan, about the laughter, about the thing we saw, but every time the words left my mouth, they felt absurd, like a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. The officer listened, his pen scratching against his notebook. When I mentioned the smiling figure, he paused. "Are you sure you saw this person?" he asked. I nodded. We all did. It wasn't human. It couldn't have been. The officer exchanged a glance with the one at the door. "And Ryan, you said you saw his body near the tree?" "Yes," I replied, my voice trembling. "He was there. We all saw him. But when we got out of the car, he was gone." The officer leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "We didn't find any signs of a body, but we did find this." He reached into a folder and pulled out a plastic evidence bag. Inside was Ryan's phone. My stomach dropped as I recognized it. The screen was cracked, but it still displayed the last photo in his gallery. Ryan's grinning face, his eyes hollow and lifeless. "This was found near the tree," the officer continued. "Does this mean anything to you?" I swallowed hard, shaking my head. "I don't know." They didn't press further.